what's actually going on when you enter the DMT space is your brain is constructing a new reality model. I see DMT as a technology for communicating with intelligences that are way beyond anything that exists in this universe.
And that's why when I came back, I was so torn about this reality, because I was like, holy shit. Yeah. There are other realities out there that are so much more real than this one.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure, a special, very special pleasure today to welcome Dr. Andrew Gallimore to Unstoppable. Mate, it has got to be one of the most exciting interviews that I've ever... Like this morning, as I was actually saying to you before we actually jumped on, as soon as I got my run sheet this morning, well, actually, it started when the girls put you in front of me, because until my producers put me in front of you, I put you in front of me. I actually hadn't heard of you, but as soon as they did, I was like, fuck, I need to speak to this guy, get him on. And then they got you on. They told me they got you. And then, yeah, your run sheet blessed my coffee table this morning. And I picked it up and was like, right, what are the podcasts today? And then I saw and I was like, holy grail. Now, for those of you who don't know who Andrew is, Andrew, why don't you just give us a little bit of what do you say when you go to a dinner party and people say, oh, so what do you do?
Wow, it depends on the type of dinner party. I mean, the dinner parties I go to, I can normally be pretty open. I mean, I would normally start and kind of test the water and say, well, I'm a neurobiologist. I'm interested in the brain. And if they're interested, and hopefully they are, then I might push it a little further and say, well, I'm actually interested in molecules that change the brain. I'm interested in drugs, certain types of drugs, and then we push it. And then eventually we get to, I'm into psychedelics, man. And then either they go, why on earth are you interested in that? Or they go, whoa, that's fucking awesome, man. And then we get into a conversation. So I'm very open about the fact that I'm interested in psychedelics. I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of. This is 21st century, for goodness sake. But still, one does have to be a little bit careful, especially in Japan, because it's still a little bit dodgy here, and people's opinions about drugs generally tend to be irrational. So you can't count on them having a rational opinion about even psychedelics. Often they will kind of lump them together with other. I think you're into meth or something.
Yeah,
it's
right.
A bit weird.
I am curious though, because you obviously started out with an interest in the brain. At what point was there a divergence into wanting to know specifically about psychedelics and their impacts and their effects?
Well, actually, it was the other way around. So actually, I became interested in the psychedelics first when I was a teenager.
Wow.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, I became fascinated with psychedelics. And I thought, I really need to learn about these. And so I actually started getting into more chemistry and pharmacology. So I was interested in the drugs and how they interact with the body. And that's what I did for the first 10 years of my academic career, really. And then I realized, look, if I really want to understand psychedelics and how they're actually working in the brain, because obviously that's where their main site of action is, then I need to move more into a neurobiological territory. And so that's when I shifted focus from the molecules and their kind of molecular level drug receptor interactions, as we call it, to the brain. And so now I work at the university in Okinawa in Japan, where I study the brain. I use computational modeling, mathematical modeling, to try to understand how this very complex piece of information generating machinery in our heads actually works, and how psychedelics affect the way that machine works.
And it really is quite interesting, because when you start to see the literature, especially the brain scans, and you start to see what the befores and afters look like in a whole range of different scenarios, it really does kind of open up the bigger questions into what is actually going on in the brain and when this is happening, because there is an incredibly high level of function. Now, before we get into that, I am curious to know where did it all start? Was there an experience, you mentioned in your teenage years where, you were introduced to them either intellectually or maybe through experience, but what was the moment where you went, oh my God, I'm going to dedicate clearly you're dedicating your life to understanding it. What was that moment?
Yeah, there was I'm dedicating my life specifically just to psychedelics generally, but specifically to DMT, dimethyltryptamine. To me, that's the king. And I when I was a teenager, I wasn't kind of a brave psychonaut kind of guy. I was a little bit wary of psychedelics. I was scared of, I heard the horror stories, and I was a little bit frightened. If I take some acid or I take some mushrooms, I'm going to be stuck in this hell realm for several hours, and there's no way out, right? So they interested me, but from a distance. And then I was at a friend's house, one of my oldest friend, way back in my kind of home village. And I was leafing through his books. I was maybe about 15 or 16 years old. And I pulled off a book, and it's a very old book. And they had a small section in the book about psychedelics. And there was the usual kind of suspects was in there, LSD, mushrooms. And there was a small paragraph, it said DMT. And it described it as this LSD-like experience, but only lasts 15 minutes, the businessman's trip. I thought, oh, that's interesting. This is like a psychedelic you can take. It's like LSD. Of course, it isn't, but that's what they said. And it lasts for 15 minutes. So you're only there, whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, for 15 minutes. And I thought, okay, that's really interesting. Now, in those days, this was 1995, 96. Wow, so not many people had the internet in their home. So you couldn't Google DMT. So I had to go to the local library in the city centre and actually find out what DMT stood for. It was that kind of difficult. And then, weirdly, the following week, I was at school, and a friend of mine, because I've been talking about psychedelics for a while, a friend of mine brought me this magazine. He said, "Oh, you might be interested in this," and it was just a regular kind of weekly magazine. But on the back page was an interview with Terence McKenna. And it described his work and his interest, particularly in his favorite drug, as they called it, DMT. And so it was like, I was kind of pushed onto this path, and I've never looked back. So at that point, I changed all of my subjects I was studying at school. I thought, okay, I need to study chemistry, I need to study biology, mathematics. Yeah. So I completely shifted, got into that, and then through my kind of academic career in university, I was always interested, always moving towards becoming someone who does psychedelic research of some kind, and I'm still on that path.
So at what point did you actually get exposed to the experiential nature of your interests, either from an observation and in a medical environment, or like as a subject yourself?
So that would have been a couple of years after that. So that would have been when I went to university. So that's of course when for a large number of people these kind of things happen, right? So so initially it was mushrooms, and then a few years later, probably 4 years later, actually when I was in Cambridge, was actually the first time that I came across the great spirit molecule itself, DMT. And that was, I'd been interested in DMT for years before that, of course, since, 5, 6, 7 years. But you'd hear the stories, you'd hear Terence McKenna saying, death by astonishment, and he kind of think, whoa, really, Terence? And then you kind of smoking, like, oh, fuck, yeah. Okay, I understand what he was saying now, and that was a pivotal moment in my life, because it became I went from being someone who was interested in these drugs objectively from the outside to actually being someone who had actually been to that place and knew exactly what I was getting into, so to speak, and that really cemented my fascination, and here we are.
Now, before we go down that rabbit hole, which is going to be a very deep, windy one with lots of intersections, I'm curious because again, some people will probably assume, depending on their level of exposure to psychedelics, but specifically DMT, here we go. These boys are going to have a big conversation now about, the drug taking and, all of the negative associations that some people might have associated with these types of substances. What I found really interesting is I got exposed to psychedelics. It was in my, I think it was in my mid-teens, but it wasn't until I think it was my late 20s where I actually picked up my first book on ayahuasca. And I actually read this massive book that was actually written by a psychotherapist. And it was about 56 accounts of patients that she had with chronic conditions around addiction and mental illness that she had not been able to treat, and she had taken them to the jungle, and she'd been able to cure or at least create significant levels of significant levels of treatment change in about 82% of them. And I remember I was about 28 at the time, and when I got my hands on this book, like it just sat with me. But then I started through the pursuit of knowledge in the areas of performance and the pursuit of knowledge in the areas of spirituality and consciousness. More information started to come across my field, and then I became familiar with James Fadiman's work, and that's when it really kind of became clear to me that holy shit, like there's the Western aspect of psychedelics. There's also the Eastern and the other cultural aspects of psychedelics and how they've been used. But clinically, we actually know a hell of a lot about these substances and how they've been used. And in some cases, how successfully they've been used, going back as far as the 1950s and 1960s. So I'm curious from your perspective, before we start getting into the therapeutic aspects, first of all, when you got in, did you see that there was going to be a therapeutic benefit here? Like, was that something that you were kind of wide into, or was there more a curiosity to understand what was happening?
Well, I think anyone who studied psychedelics certainly is aware of the history and is aware of as you mentioned, going back all the way back to the 50s. Psychedelics were showing great promise in therapeutic contexts, and even with DMT, in fact, DMT there was trials with kind of clinical trials, experiments in humans anyway, way back in the 1950s. But for me, I don't think I could have predicted the almost revolutionary, almost kind of revolutionary effect psychedelics are going to have. And I think that many people still don't accept that. But in my opinion, it's going to be penicillin levels of, like there's basically medicine can be broken up basically two eras: pre-penicillin and post-penicillin. Pre-penicillin, you got an infection, good night. Post-penicillin, you get an infection, well, it's pretty easy to treat. It's hard to believe, really, what it must have been like to live in a pre-penicillin era. And that is what I think psychedelics are basically the penicillin of the 21st century, in the psychiatric penicillin, in that they are going to completely revolutionize. I couldn't have predicted that. I think largely because I am interested in kind of some of the weirder aspects. There are lots of people interested in psychedelics and their therapeutic potential, and doing a lot of awesome work in that regard. But I've always been drawn towards the weird stuff. I've been drawn towards alien intelligence and machine elves and that kind of stuff, rather than therapeutics. But certainly, I'm very aware of what these drugs are going to do to psychiatric medicine.
Well, that certainly gives us a good direction for the conversation. But if anything, I'm really trying to create a stable foundation here of understanding there is literally decades of research that essentially fundamentally explain what you're talking about here in terms of the shift that we're about to experience. And I see this being bigger than cannabis because, when cannabis became legalized, there wasn't that much medical literature around, in terms of the therapeutic benefits biologically, biochemically, and also, therapeutically. Now there's a lot of research that's been done into it, but there's compelling research that comes all the way back from the 1950s. And correct me if I'm wrong, weren't psychedelics originally synthesized by accident by Dr. Albert Hofmann, I think in 1948. He was playing with tryptamines, and I think he was trying to put together a hay fever formula or something. I can't remember. I know he was playing with tryptamines, put a combination together, got some on his hands, which is equivalent to about a 200 milligram dose, and that was the famous ride home. Since then, they thought that they could use that as a substance to better understand the psychotic mind. They thought, well, if I take this, I'm losing my mind, so it gives me the empathy perspective and the experiential perspective. But then they started to realize there was significant benefits psychotherapeutically when it came to a whole range of conditions, which you pointed to.
Yes.
But then you've got this whole other side of the equation, and rightly said, what we're seeing now in this third wave is how people are using psilocybin, LSD, and even in some cases DMT for treatment of depression. In some cases, PTSD. I know me personally, I had a lot of success with high dose LSD and MDMA to treat what would have been 30 years of chronic PTSD, high level PTSD. And it's being used in a whole range of different other psychotherapeutic ways for mental illness. But there's also this other side where it gives us access to something. It gives us access to a level of intelligence. It gives us access, in some cases, to what could be perceived as other alternate dimensions, other alternate beings, in some cases, civilizations. And that's not really talked about as much, which is really quite interesting.
Yeah.
And so from your perspective, apart from people thinking that, oh, hang on, this guy's absolutely batshit crazy, he actually talks to the machine else. Is that why you think so many people stay away from that side of the intelligence?
I think, I mean, orthodox scientists tend to avoid it because it's a no-go zone. It cannot be entertained, the idea that taking a drug could actually give access to some kind of orthogonal hyperdimensional reality filled, teeming with intelligent beings. I mean, that's unthinkable. And thus, I wrote.
Until you actually do it.
Yeah, I don't care. I mean, I'm not. I really don't care. And that's. I'm not one of these people who's trying to climb up this academic ladder and worried about what other scientists think of me at all. And I've never been like that. I'm in academia to learn, but I'm not. I'm not going to be a professor in 10 years' time. Put it that way.
Yeah, right.
So I've never been concerned about that, which is why I've been perfectly happy to say things that get me called, a quack, a pseudoscientist. I've been called names, but who gives a fuck? I mean, it really doesn't bother me at all. But regular scientists will shy away from that kind of discussion. Not all of them. There are some. I mean, people like David Luke at Greenwich University, a friend of mine, probably. Certainly in the UK is I would say the foremost DMT researcher, and he works on psychic phenomena and other kind of anomalous stuff. And he certainly entertains the idea because, once you've been there, the thing is, once you've been to this place, a lot of these scientists have never been there. When I say been there, I mean to the DMT world, right? And they wouldn't, and so they've never felt the force of how compelling that space is and how truly undeniably real it is, and the complexity and the power of these intelligences are. And that to me is the sure convincer. Terence McKenna used to say, give me 5 minutes of time, 5 minutes of your time, and I'll show you, right? People who would dismiss the experience as mere hallucination. And this has been going on since the 1950s. So when I wrote a paper with David Luke, actually 2 or 3 years ago, and we looked back at all of the literature from the 1950s of DMT, all the human experiments, looking for trip reports basically in the literature where they would describe the experience of their patients when they injected them with DMT. All we found most of the time was tiny snippets, and subjects saw complex hallucinations, but there was very little in terms of the actual structure. Doctors weren't interested, scientists weren't interested in what you saw. It was a hallucinogen, it caused hallucinations. The nature of those hallucinations and the structure and the content was not interesting to them. And I think that seems still to be the case for a lot of scientists now, who will just regard, most of them have never taken DMT, and they will say DMT is just another short-acting powerful hallucinogen, but they don't really understand what DMT is, and DMT is something very different. I think very few people who smoke high dose DMT would come back and say, oh, it's just hallucination. There's something else going on, something that, in my opinion, and in my scientific opinion as well, not just in my personal subjective opinion, in my neuroscientific opinion, the DMT state, the DMT realities, the DMT worlds are actually confounding. They are difficult to explain in terms of modern orthodox neuroscience.
I did, it probably would have been 18 months of research before I reintegrated myself back into some form of psychedelic therapy. I think it was maybe 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I picked up Jane Fadiman's book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. I started to read that book. I quickly found another book called The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman.
Yeah.
Consumed both of those books and a whole range of others. And it's interesting because when I started doing the research, I was exactly like you. I was interested in the psychedelics to understand, the therapeutic benefits. But as soon as I started talking about DMT being the most, like the king of the psychedelics and its relationship with plant medicine, especially with ayahuasca, I became super fascinated and I went deep real hard. But I spent like 18 months before I had my first experience. And then to echo what you said, I still remember my first experience as coming back when I didn't have the breakthrough on the first one. It was probably my second or third, I think it was my third experience where I had a complete breakthrough. And it was at that point I was like you, I came back and the couple that I had been journeying with said to me, "So what did you see?" And I was like, I started laughing. I was like, how the fuck do you explain that? Like, there's just no words. But the interesting component was I kept on coming back and going, I need to go back because, like you said, there's something more, in some cases, something more real about this dimension than there is about the dimension that we even live in.
Yeah.
And so I started doing more and more of the journeys. But what I started to discover was it started to come down to the more comfortable you became with the experience, the easier it was to navigate. And there was almost like this relationship between exposure to the process to the point where you're no longer going, where you can actually relax enough to go, let me actually have a look around while I'm here. And is that something that you've noticed as you've progressed with the research that you've done? The more you experience this dimension, the more able you are to relax yourself into a state of, I guess, greater levels of awareness as you navigate, and does that in itself affect your ability to navigate in that dimension?
Yes, in my opinion, that's definitely the case. The problem with DMT is that, as you say, it's first of all it's very disorienting. You're thrust into this space. You tumble through this hyperdimensional, complex, geometric forms, and it's bewildering and it's astonishing. It's truly astonishing. It's shocking. It's shocking. You kind of thrust and burst into this reality that you could never even have conceived of existing. It's impossible. You enter an impossible space, a space that not only could you not think of existing, cannot exist. And that is completely confounding. There's no way to get your head around that. A minute ago, I was in this normal world that I'm familiar with. Now I'm in this bizarre world that is impossible. And yet here I am, and I'm fully alert. And yet I can't make any sense of it. That, I think, for most people, probably often for people who don't take DMT that often that's always the experience, and they never get past that. However, more experienced users with practice can learn to, okay, this is it. I've been here before, just relax, and actually the experience can then start to stabilize. And I think with longer experiences as well, I mean, you mentioned Rick Strassman, who I did some work with and trying to extend the experience over a longer period of time using an intravenous infusion device. We believe that over time, the experience will stabilize, because what's actually going on when you enter the DMT space is your brain is constructing a new reality model. Your brain is always constructing the world you experience from moment to moment during normal waking life is kind of a model of the environment that your brain is constructing to make sense of the sensory information it's receiving. When you enter the DMT space, your brain has to construct an entirely new model of reality in order to experience the DMT space. And that in itself is actually quite difficult to explain, because the brain didn't evolve to construct the DMT worlds, presumably. It evolved to construct this normal waking world we're in now. However, we believe that over time, the longer you're in this space, the brain will kind of settle down and start to make sense and pick up kind of sensory landmarks. And hopefully then the space will become more amenable to kind of navigation and even mapping. I mean, we've discussed before the idea that you might eventually be able to map in some meaningful way the structure of the DMT space and where you might find specific types of entities and that kind of thing.
How have you found as a traveler managing what dimension that you slip yourself into? Because obviously, depending on, setting so many different variables. Oftentimes you can take the same amount of dosage, but you'll end up somewhere completely different, in a completely different context. What are some of the things that you've learned when it comes to navigating a re-entry into dimensions that you want to frequent, that you've got some familiarity with, or that you've seen? You go, well, I want to go back there. How do I get back to that one?
It's difficult, and it's very unreliable. It's kind of like, I always imagine if you were an alien and you were dropped to a random position on Earth. You'd be on Earth, but whether you landed on rush hour in Hanoi or whether you landed in the Siberian tundra, it's going to be essentially two different worlds you're going to experience. And imagine that, but with a space that's contains many more dimensions and is infinitely larger and more complex. It's not surprising that every time you go there, you tend to the weird thing about the DMT space is it's very distinctly DMT-esque. Instantly, as soon as the vapor goes into your lungs, instantly, okay, oh fuck, here we go. And there's this very distinctive carrot. Yeah, exactly. There's that carrier signal. There's something about the geometry that's very DMT-esque, and as you're going through. But then once you burst through, and you described breaking through in your third attempt, once you break through this membrane, this veil, the chrysanthemum, as Terence McKenna used to call it, then often you will burst into completely different space each time. There are a number of types of spaces that people often refer to and say, oh, have you been to the dome? Or have you been to this particular area or that area? Or have you met these kind of beings? So there seem to be a lot of commonalities, but it takes a lot of experience to actually direct yourself to any particular space. I think for me personally, it's about intent, on knowing where you want to go and what you want to meet. And I've spoken to a number of people who are able to meet the same entity, the same being in the space time after time, simply by having the intent to actually meet those entities. Terence McKenna used to call the machine owl and said, "Come on in, little man," and they would come bounding out of the space. He said, right? So you can learn. I think it's just experience and learning to understand what's going on, to not lose your bearings and die by astonishment entirely. And to have the intent of going to that space, and it takes work. This is not an easy space to navigate.
This is probably some of the hardest work you'll ever, in my opinion, as someone who loves doing work on yourself. This is death practice at the highest level. Now, every DMT journey, you are jumping out of a plane. Like, it is a death practice for me. But I am curious, because when I first started experimenting with DMT, I'd already experimented with LSD and psilocybin, and 4-ACO DMT. And some MDMA and 2CB. But again, I was looking very much for therapeutic performance benefits. I wasn't doing this purely for recreational benefit, although there's always that added benefit where you come out feeling, a little bit better than when you went in. But one of the things, I just kept on going back to DMT. I couldn't get away from it. But I kept asking the question, how do I stay here longer so that I can actually spend more time to navigate? And I'd already done ayahuasca a couple of times. That was actually how I got introduced. And I started thinking about going back to Aya, and maybe, because that's what the medicine men of old did, is they said, well, this compound breaks down very quickly. I think it breaks down within 7 minutes in the liver. Like, it's got a half-life of 7 to 15 minutes. And so the medicine men worked out if they blended certain compounds together, I think one of them being, I can't remember the pronunciation, but I believe it's got a compound in it called Hamala. And when they combine Harmaline, with the DMT, they were able to extend people's journeys for, in some cases 6, 7, 8 hours. And so what I'm curious to know, did you end up trying DMT? Did you end up trying Aya in a ceremonial context, and contrast to the DMT in what would be considered maybe a little bit of a clinical context that you play with it in?
No.
Or do you play with DMT in a clinical context? Is there a ceremonial aspect to what you do in your own way?
No, I've actually never taken ayahuasca.
Wow.
Which surprises people, but it's weird. I've kind of gone straight to the main course, which I regard DMT as kind of,
I totally get it.
I'm certainly not against ayahuasca, and it's something that I would do in the future. But I would certainly do it in a ritual context. I'm not like Terence McKenna making it in his kitchen, making extra strong batches just for himself. I don't fancy that idea, but I'm certainly open to doing it in a more ritual context. But the opportunity simply hasn't arisen. I've been so busy, kind of working in within sort of academia that getting to places, going to Peru or something to do this kind of stuff. There's actually a guy in Okinawa, believe it or not, that does it. But yeah, anyway, I can't mention his name or anything like that. But apparently he does it in caves. Okinawa cave ayahuasca, which is kind of cool.
There are people in Silicon. I'm sure you know about this. There are actual, what we call, I'm not sure what they call the new age shamans in Silicon Valley and other parts, and
yeah,
the US and the rest of the world, who are taking executives on these ayahuasca retreats and these mushroom retreats.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not keen on that. I'm not keen on some Silicon Valley startup guy giving me ayahuasca, to be honest.
but to come back to my other question, is there a ceremonial aspect to what you do, to the way that you use or treat the molecule?
It's a good question, and ceremonial is an interesting word because it brings to mind. Go on.
I was going to say, let me phrase that, pair that word with, is there a ceremonial aspect to what you do that would reflect a level of respect for the compound that you're playing with? Because although you might just have a ritual, you might not consider it ceremonial, but I'm sure you, with the practice you've had, you would have a deep level of respect for the compound because it's something that can really do incredible things or kick your ass at the same time.
I agree. And it's a really interesting question because actually the way that you treat a molecule depends on how you see that molecule. So for some people, treating the molecule with respect means to light a candle, light incense, say a little prayer, an incantation of some sort, and then they have this beautiful hand-blown glass pipe that was brought from India or something like that, and that kind of thing. That's treating it with respect. Now, for me, it's slightly different in that I see DMT as a technology. I see it as a technology for communicating with intelligences that are way beyond anything that exists in this universe, probably. And thus, I think the way that you respect DMT is learning to use it as a technology. We've been gifted wherever that technology came from. It's here, it's everywhere. It's waiting for us to discover it and to learn how to use it. And I think it's somewhat disrespectful to actually assume that these kind of traditional or old methods, the methods that have been used for decades of vaporizing DMT in a small glass pipe, are the be all and end all. I think we should be bringing our best tools to the table, using our most advanced drug administration technologies to bear here. Let's use the tools from anesthesiology. Let's use the tools from this branch of medicine. Let's bring everything we've got so that you don't just burst into this bizarre realm and kind of look around wide-eyed for 5 minutes and go, whoa, and then kind of bugger off again. That's not respectful to me. I mean, that's the best we could do for quite a while, but it's not diplomatic. And I kind of see myself as an interdimensional diplomat in some ways. We all should. Yeah. We're ambassadors for our species from this little kind of, we're little kind of monkey brains, but we're doing our best, right? And we're making the most of it. And we do have some pretty decent technology for drug administration. So why aren't we using those? Why aren't we using target-controlled intravenous infusion like the anesthesiologists use to bring someone into that space and keep them there, keep the level of DMT in their brain constant over time so that they can arrive, introduce yourself, and spend some time communicating and learning about, two-way process.
It's interesting you're saying we should use it as a technology, and a lot of people might scoff or laugh at that. But what I find really interesting is the fact that the government has been doing it probably since the 50s with Ultra X. It's been used as a technology for a whole range of different outcomes. One of them being obviously mind control. But I would be death-defied surprised if the government hadn't already done extensive research with the use of this as some form of technology. I just can't fathom that it hasn't been used in somehow, somewhere, some agency in some dark room
Oh yeah.
for interstellar communications and networking.
Well, you're getting a bit Alex Jones here, but
well, you know, I've got
you know, it's kind of
the feed's breaking up. We're getting shut down.
yeah. Oh, it's crazy, man. But I mean, it's weird when I remember when Alex Jones, he returned to the Rogan show, of course, and that's when he kind of went off on these clockwork owls and the CIA, these dark arms of the intelligence services have been using DMT. And I wrote, and people kind of said, "Oh, fucking hell, you know, Alex Jones again, batshit crazy." But I wrote an article immediately after that, and I said, "Look, you know, Alex Jones is a bit mad, or a lot mad sometimes." But he might not be so far from the truth here, because, you know, scientists like me, we are a small group, scientists like myself, that actually take the idea of interdimensional communication with alien intelligences quite seriously. And if there's people like me now, there certainly would have been people like me in the past that had perhaps even people within the intelligence services. So there's no doubt the intelligence services would have known about DMT. It's one of the big four psychedelics. So they work with LSD, certainly, as you mentioned, and used it for rather nefarious purposes. And so it would surprise me a lot if they hadn't worked with DMT. And the question is, you know, what did they do with it? What did they discover? Were they, in fact, did they discover a means of extending the experience and to actually put subjects into contact with other intelligences over an extended period of time? And this is the kind of thing we're kind of rediscovering now, I think.
So has there been any experiments done with the anesthesiology technology to be able to administer, you know, almost like a consistent dose that enables people to, you know, essentially stay in that world either for an unset amount of period or just an extended amount of period of time?
Yeah, so, well, I wrote a paper with Rick Strassman in 2016, and we basically, it's not straightforward in that you can't just kind of give somebody a steady drip and kind of keep them there, because drugs, when they enter the body, they're entering a very complex system, and the drug will be metabolized and distribute through the circulatory system before it even gets into the brain, and then it's metabolized again. So you need a mathematical model, what's called a pharmacokinetic model, that tells you all about how quickly and where and how fast the drug is metabolized, how it's distributed, and the rates of all this stuff. And so you can model over time, mathematically, the levels of drug in the brain, and you can actually devise the correct dose over time so that you can bring someone into the space and then actually hold the level of drug in the brain reasonably constant or within quite a narrow window over time. And so it's not straightforward to do. And so,
right.
But there's a group in London who's working on implementing this model that myself and Rick developed in humans, but it still needs work. It was really a proof of principle paper that we wrote to show that actually the kind of special, unique pharmacological peculiarities of DMT means that it is actually amenable to be used in this way. Yeah.
What have you found effects? Because again, you know, we're now talking about getting people into the realm where we can keep them there at a stable level, where the bloods are stable. But then when it comes to the psychonaut themselves, how are they able to maintain that, I guess you'd call that dimensional level? Because I'm assuming, you know, you're traversing a range of different dimensions depending on where you break through. That's an assumption on my part anyway. But then what have you found have been the most important things as the traveler when it comes to maintaining, because obviously you've got the equipment that can maintain blood level, but what have you found is required at a psychological level to maintain navigation without, like, you know, essentially falling through a range of different categories because your mind is perhaps a little bit untrained or untamed?
Yeah, the answer is we don't know because we haven't tried it yet in humans. But yeah, I think, as you suggest, it's going to be challenging, and as I said earlier,
what have you learned?
It's going to take experience
when it comes to the psychological intersection of navigation. Because one of the things, obviously, we've all observed in that process is wherever your mind goes, you just follow it, and it's, You know, some of the most profound experiences I've had is when I've had a level of intent on where my mind was going was number one. And the second one was where I had nothing in my mind. I literally had nothing. And that was the most incredible experience. There was a zero. There was like an empty space. Like I had maybe, it felt like it could have been a 7-minute Satori. It could have been 20 seconds, maybe even 2. But what's your experience there?
For me, I'm not particularly, personally, I'm not that good at it. I tend to lose control a lot. I'm more of a kind of a free rider, in that I will just enter this space, not really have a clue where I'm going, and end up in entirely different spaces each time, and it'd be equally amazed and equally astonished wherever I end up. Whereas other people I know who I've spoken to are much more skilled. I'm very good at the kind of the neuroscience and explaining things and thinking about things, but there are much better people than me, much better pilots than me. I kind of build the plane and they
I get
they
it.
fly
Everyone
it.
has their role. No, I get it. I get it. I totally get it.
I think some people, I mean, they will be found. These people exist, people who really are very, very familiar. And they're often people who are older people. Normally, we're not talking about psychonaut teenagers who are just kind of off their faces 24/7. Often these are older people that have been meditating for 40 years and are experienced with very, very large numbers of drugs and all range of different states of consciousness and different types of meditation and stuff. And they are often the best people because they really do know how to navigate this space. And these are the kind of people I think that will be recruited into any kind of extended state DMT program, in my opinion, anyway.
It's interesting because I like that little deframe there about it's not so much about the drugs, it is the state of consciousness that the drugs are creating. One of the things I discovered from my own experience was that desire to stay in that state, in that realm for longer. And that's when I was saying I started to entertain, should I be going back to ayahuasca and more of the traditional routes? And then I came across an environment where I found what's now referred to as pharmawaska. I don't know if you've heard of pharmawaska.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is just the DMT fumate with the harmaline. And so it's essentially, it's almost like the doctor's, the medical way of taking ayahuasca. You're taking the two compounds, or those two powerful compounds that are in ayahuasca. But I found it to be a radically different experience. It was not even in the same ballpark. And the only thing that even came close to contextualizing it was when I accidentally inhaled about 200 milligrams of liquid DMT when I got the tuning settings on my vaporizer wrong. I was looking for an easier way to fly.
Yeah.
And I actually had liquid DMT and I put it in a really nice, a really beautiful vaporizer, but I was trying to work out the ampage and the wattage and the burn rate. And I clearly got it wrong. And I ended up doing the calculations later. It was about maybe 250 milligram dose. And my entire world caved in. Like it was a total death of self, total death of reality, death of every role in my, and I literally even woke up. And this was probably one of the most real experiences that I've had whilst piloting and with the molecule, is I literally woke up in I'm not sure if it was an underground bunker or a spaceship, but I just woke up as another being. I literally woke up as another being that was attached to something. And there was a woman in front of me who was like, "Oh my God, we weren't expecting you yet." And then I literally started to freak out. And then I came back and I had a moment where I was like, "Oh my God, I'm trapped in another dimension here." And I had a moment where I was like, "I think I'm going to have a fucking freak out here." And I calmed myself down and I got back into my skin and everything started to come back together. But it was, instead of it being like a 7 to 15 minute journey, it ended up being about 30 to 35, which was quite long. But it served its purpose because it was about 3 months later when I did the pharmawaska, and the pharmawaska took me to that level, but it held me there for about 2 hours.
Wow.
And that was the most humbling experience of my life, because I even remember the person, the pharmacologist who had put it together. He goes, "Look, this is the closest thing that I can tell you is to a godlike experience where you actually get a godlike perspective." And I remember when he told me that, just thinking, that's a big claim. That's a big claim. And the whole time, all I could say in my head was, "Fuck, he's right." He's not kidding. And literally every few minutes, I'd be like clicking my fingers, biting the inside of my mouth, just touching myself because I wasn't sure if I was there. And when I opened my eyes, and I've had this experience before with 4-ACO DMT, where you start to see aspects of code dropping, hieroglyphics code in that orange kind of flavor. And, I've seen aspects of it on the way into DMT journeys, but on this one, I opened my eyes and I just saw cross-dimensional code, and it was just falling, and it was all sorts of characters, hieroglyphics, like every character you can imagine. And it took me probably a good week to come back from that, but it was really one of probably the most profound experiences that I'd had, being able to maintain that. But the navigation was almost made more difficult by the fact that it was just so extreme. I literally felt like I was sitting on the ring of consciousness for about an hour and a half, and just trying to hang on. If not for the fact that I hadn't had that experience prior, there's a possibility I could have been, possibly quite overwhelmed.
Yeah. I mean, that's it's not surprising, but it's interesting when you describe waking up as another being. That's actually I've heard reports of that before. People with very high doses will describe waking up, for example, in a room, in a completely alien room, surrounded by other alien beings, in a pod, and then there are two alien beings over them, and they say, so, oh, we brought you back for maintenance, or we didn't expect you back, that kind of thing. And I've never experienced that, but it really kind of shows you. I mean, that experience is completely real to them. It's as real as the experience of being.
It was the most real experience I've ever had in my entire life. And that's why when I came back, I was so torn about this reality, because I was like, holy shit, there are other realities out there that are so much more real than this one.
Yeah, exactly.
And when I was like, I literally felt like for a good hour, I was shown the logistic network of what's maintaining this level of reality. And so when I came back, I was just, all I could do was just, say wow for a week. I just was in total awe.
Yeah, exactly. So DMT it seems to show you often the underlying structure of things, and that I think is often as overwhelming and terrifying and astonishing as anything else. Anything, as well as these kind of intelligent beings, it's also being shown how it works, and having had no idea it worked like this, and what is the relationship between our flimsy little three-dimensional reality and this incredible system that's maintaining it, and seeing behind the curtain and going, that is astonishing. And I've certainly seen that before. I think one thing that tends to happen for many people is there is a difficulty in bringing information back. So you will often be shown these things, and then your brain, either it's a defense mechanism and your brain is saying, okay, I'm not, you're not seeing that again. I'm not allowing you to remember that. Or it's actually the brain is struggling. Once you come back to this normal low-dimensional, three-dimensional reality that we exist in normally, it's very difficult for the brain to formulate a memory. I mean, memories are partially reliving. When you remember something, your brain is kind of reconstructing it, and it's very difficult in the absence of DMT being there. Very difficult for the brain to kind of reconstruct what happened to you. And so people will, Terence McKenna was saying this back in the 80s, people will be rambling. They'll come out of the experience raving and raving. Oh my God, oh my God, oh God. And then 5 minutes later, they're like, what happened? And it's all gone. It's like sand going through your fingers. It's there and then it's gone. It's like, so write it down as soon as you get back. Is always whatever, or speaking to a microphone is probably much better. Speaking to a microphone, just get out, rave, and then go back to it. You might be able to piece something together. But again, people seem to develop skills in bringing back information as well, and learning to remember the experience.
And I think, as you said, that comes through experience, because the more you experience the dimension, the less stressful it is. And then in most cases, the less fear that you have around it, which would enable you to operate cognitively at a higher level for retention purposes. But I guess when you look at the early human experience, specifically with DMT, a lot of the earlier cultures, South American specifically, and other cultures. I think the Aboriginals I understand, also used to have their methods for extraction for DMT. But I'm curious, they used to refer to it as an intelligence, but oftentimes I'd refer to it as an intelligence called mother. It's like or Mother Earth, or giving people access to, a network that enables them to communicate with, Mother Earth or another level of frequency of, on the planet. What's your take on that, or your interpretation?
Well, I think Sorry.
I was going to say, yes, we've covered it is a technology, but I guess this is a little bit more contextualization, because it's been used as a technology for thousands of years. I just guess our relationship with that technology has moved perhaps from one of being very earthbound, although multidimensional giving, to now where we're looking at as being, almost like, well, it's now technology. Pharmawaska, they're talking about producing pharmawaska in pills where psychiatrists can actually administer it.
Yeah, I think what's clear is that since in the entire history of DMT use, whether it's in these traditional preparations, this decoction known as ayahuasca, or through snuffs or whatever, it's been pretty obvious to everyone that's used DMT from the very beginning that there is some kind of it's giving access to some kind of intelligence, to some kind of other apparently conscious beings that appear to be much older, much wiser, much more intelligent. And so it's perhaps not surprising that in indigenous cultures, this is seen as mother. In modern cultures, we might see it as God, or as the alien intelligence from the stars. I think in all cases, you're looking perhaps at the same kind of phenomenon, but through a different cultural lens. In the indigenous cultures, they have their own worldview, which is plant spirits, whereas we have a very different one. In the 1950s, for example, when people were doing experiments with DMT, they would often describe seeing gods or spirits. Now that is a very much what you would expect in the 1950s, whereas now people would refer to them more as being entities or aliens or something like that. I think often perhaps people are seeing the same intelligences, and they have the same idea that these are much more powerful and older and more intelligent, but they just interpret them in a different way, I think.
Interpretation. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of. So, mate, I know you've looked at this in a very different lens than most other people, but I'm sure with your experience, you've probably identified that there are certain personalities that really shouldn't, even consider doing this type of work, or journeying on these types of experiences, or taking these types of experiences. Like, what have you learned when it comes to identifying who really should be, following this path and perhaps exploring? And again, always under the context of research. And as I said, and I want to just make this really clear, I did about 18 months to almost 2 years of research before playing with the molecule, extensive research, reading, hundreds of articles, and, having dozens of conversations before exposing myself to the experience itself. And I was doing it with a very high level of awareness around the potential dangers, shortfalls, and everything in between, and which I'd categorize as a very responsible way to do it. Which is what I'm echoing here. But I've also kind of realized that there are certain personalities in my experience that probably are best to stay away from it. Most of those personalities know, because they're just not interested. But have you kind of identified through your experience that maybe there's a few things to watch for that would suggest that people should maybe not even entertain the molecule?
I mean, obviously there are medical conditions. I mean, there are psychiatric conditions where obviously I would never recommend as such that anyone goes out and takes these drugs. Psychedelics, it's a very personal thing. These are very personal drugs. They're affecting the fundamental structure of your reality, and also in high doses they're affecting your sense of self. In many cases, they will completely shatter your sense of self, and that is a shattering experience and quite frightening. And if you suffer from pre-existing psychiatric conditions, if you're anxious, or you're depressed, or you're not completely kind of well in that regard psychologically, then I think psychedelics can be extremely useful for these people, but with the right support and in the right setting. So this is where you
Yes.
go to one of the, I mean, hopefully in the next 10 years or so, they're going to be more and more psychedelic. Well, I'm sure there will be more and more psychedelic, professionally trained psychedelic therapists who will be able to give you that support. So for those kind of people, you have to be very, very careful with psychedelics. Now, obviously, there are personality types. If you've got a big ego and you think you know it all, and you think you're, the reincarnation of Maria Sabina, and you're this great shaman, and there are a lot of these people in the psychedelic space. It's just kind of weird. It's this weird paradox that whilst psychedelic drugs, they completely shatter the ego temporarily, people often return with an even bigger ego. It's like, I've been here, man. It's really weird, and you get a lot of these. If you go into the Facebook group, the psychedelic Facebook groups, man, I've been in a few kind of scuffles on there. Believe me, people saying, "You don't know anything, man. You're just a kid. Like you'll learn one day." Fuck off. I get bored. It's pretty boring, actually, but there are a lot of those kind of people, and they are pretty tiresome. To be honest, and even with DMT as well, I think there's a tendency with some people, once they go to this space, to think that they may well have seen it all. They may well have seen the underlying structure of reality, but that doesn't make you special in any way. And everybody, it's a very democratic drug, DMT, in that pretty much anyone can extract it from readily available plants, and anyone has access to this space. And none of us really know what's going on. Some of us are trying to work it out, but none of us really know. So people who think they've got a handle on reality, and they've got a handle on what DMT is and what it's doing, often are the ones that are going to get spanked when they go into this space with that attitude. Humility is key here, always the case, right? In everything in life. This is why I love Japan so much, because it's all about humility. Never be arrogant, never be disrespectful, always be humble, and go into the DMT space with that same attitude, and you'll be much more likely actually to have a positive experience if you go there just accepting, I don't know fuck all what's going on, man. I just want to meet these people, these individuals, these entities, these intelligences, and ask them, what can you show me? What can you teach me? That's a much better attitude than going in there and, as this great shaman of the 21st century.
So one of the things I found really interesting is how once you experience DMT, you see it, you smell it everywhere. Like you start to smell it in nature, you start to, in some cases, smell it on people's breaths. And it becomes a kind of a realization where, holy crap, this stuff is everywhere. It's all around us. But also it's inside us as well. Like our lungs have one of the highest concentrations of DMT, as does, the pineal gland. And I've, discovered breath work, which you might be familiar with, holotropic, and a range of different breathing techniques that I've actually been able to, in some cases, replicate mild breakthroughs without any DMT intervention whatsoever. Which adds an enormous level of curiosity, but also an enormous level of potential for further treatment, depending on regulations and how they, how they change. Have you got any anecdotal or experience when it comes to breath work and how that's been used?
So there's a number of interesting points you made there, and I think in terms of DMT being everywhere. Actually, when I first arrived in Japan, I would smell it in the bathrooms. All the toilets. I think the cleaner they use commonly in Japan has this indole kind of smell. So everywhere I was going, it smells like fucking DMT in here, everywhere. and you're right. Once you've smelt that smell, it does appear everywhere. And DMT for me has this joke. There's a gesturous quality to it. There's a maniacal kind of tricksterish quality to the experience that is undeniable. There is this comical ambience. I always talk about this, and this feeling that they're going, they're I often describe it like the universe is winking at you when you first take that first lungful of DMT and say, okay, do you get it yet? Do you get the joke? And like we live within this cosmic joke, and we take it seriously, and we think, this is the real thing, this is reality, we have to take it seriously. But these beings are going, come on, surely you realize now that it's just one huge joke. And I see DMT being everywhere as being part of that. It's like, okay, we're just going to place DMT absolutely everywhere. It's going to be in their noses, it's going to be in their bodies, it's going to be in all the plants and animals around them. But they're not going to work it out. And it'll be fun when they do, right? I kind of get that feeling. I think that's perhaps part of it. And in terms of breath work, it's not unusual people to describe that, and certainly we know it's made in the body. We don't know where it's made. I'm glad you mentioned the lungs, actually, because you're right. It's not actually, we don't actually know there's a lot of DMT in the lungs. What we know is that the key enzyme called it's a type of methyl transferase. Basically, it's responsible for kind of finishing the DMT molecule chemically. There's a lot of that in the lungs, highly expressed in the lungs. Yes, in the pineal as well, but I think the pineal is so tiny that it's unlikely that it's capable of producing sufficient quantities of DMT. But the lungs certainly would be, and that might connect to breath work. If you're doing certain types of breath work, perhaps breath work that induces hypoxic states. So people talk about like Wim Hof breathing, where you're actually becoming quite hypoxic. And DMT release has been linked by certain scientists, perhaps as a protective mechanism for the brain when it goes into a hypoxic, so low oxygen state. And so I've never experienced that. And there's been no studies that have demonstrated that people are actually having a DMT experience under these circumstances, but I wouldn't rule it out. And I think work needs to be done.
It's interesting because I'd done breath work for a number of years, and I'd done Wim Hof a couple of times. But it wasn't until I did a fast. I did like 6 weeks of juice fasting, and then I did 5 days of water fasting. And I did on the last 3 days or 4 or 5 days, I did the breath work every day, and I had nothing in my system. I had no food. I was completely empty. And I was actually having what I'd call a mild to moderate level breakthroughs that when I was coming back, I was going, holy crap, I think I've just found the lucky button. But what I have heard also
been searching that for years.
I don't know, right? All I had to do was, just hyperventilate for a couple of minutes. But I have heard of other researchers, actually academics, who have engaged in levels of research for DMT, journeying from the navigation perspective, but also therapeutic. And they've talked about the instances of some people actually bringing back entities with them. Like, have you got any experience? I've only heard this twice, but one of them was actually from what I'd refer to as, he seemed like he was quite a reputable researcher. He was an academic. And to the point where they said, we actually ended up having to, bring someone in to help with the severing of this entity attachment or something that they referred it to. And I was like, okay, that's curious. Look, with DMT, I'm open to everything because you get shown everything. But have you got any experience of people perhaps, bringing entities back or releasing energies, through portals that are open?
I wish I had. No, I'd never heard of that. I mean, when you say,
look at this.
Yeah, I mean, what is it, like a little elf on the shoulder, or
like
is
a spirit,
is it
almost like a spirit?
Okay,
yeah, not a hallucination, more of a spirit.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes more sense. I mean, I'm not surprised. People, I mean, the thing is with me is that I don't go in for all that kind of spirit stuff, or I find it hard to get my claws into. I mean, I'm a kind of a scientist. I like to have mechanisms. I like to work things out. I like to think, okay, how could this work? And then when someone says, "Oh, spirit," I'm like, "Oh, what do I do with that? How do I think about that?" Because you can go, anything goes when it comes to kind of spirits and plant spirits and gods or whatever. Because anybody could have any worldview, any kind of any way to think about that, and it's very difficult for me as a scientist that actually wants to think about these to actually get my teeth into it in a way. So I kind of avoid that because I don't know how to make sense of it. So that's why I focus on what's going on in the brain. I go to some weird far out places with my ideas and my hypotheses, but I always keep one foot in in neuroscience and in pharmacology and in chemistry, because that allows me to kind of then reach to weird places, but actually have something clear to say, I think this happens, I think this is how it happens, I think this is what's going on, rather than just talking about spirits or talking about accessing the astral plane, because anything goes there, and people have done it, and everyone else is doing that anyway. There's a whole new age crowd that are dealing with DMT in that kind of much more kind of spiritual, new agey kind of wooey kind of way that I've got no problem with, but it's just not my bag.
It's not your bag at all. I get that.
Not my bag at
so
all.
Where do you see the future of DMT? Like, obviously there's so many different avenues, but the two that are most obvious is technology, using it as a technology. But the second one is using it potentially therapeutically. The technology side, I think we've nailed that quite well. I think we've at least opened a few Pandora's box that would make people think, well, hang on, actually, here's the one thing I'll share before sharing that with you. The only one other time that I've experienced a breakthrough that wasn't DMT induced was when I had a stroke. I had a stroke in 2009.
Wow.
And I had what would probably be categorized as an NDE, or a near-death experience, where I essentially left the body, had conversations, was given information, came back, and then slowly integrated that experience over the next 6 months, and literally created a whole new body of research and work as a result of what was given to me in that experience. And so I've seen firsthand how the technology can be used in a natural setting, in a DMT intervention. I've had similar scenarios where I've come back, I've brought intelligence back with me. So I think we've done a pretty good job of exploring the potentials for technology, the potentials for innovation, the potentials for connecting neurons together that have never been connected together to create new perspectives that they've never had, which could solve existing problems. But on the medical side, not a lot of people really talk about the therapeutic benefits of DMT outside of the long journey DMT or the ayahuasca experiences. I know even Rick Strauss with his data, he was saying, it was a little neutral in terms of the potential for entheogenic benefit. But what have you found? Because I know myself, if I have a DMT experience, I'll come back and I feel sharp, I feel clear, crystal. For the next few days, or even a week, I feel like I've just got a little bit of an extra bump in my step. And so I've seen performance benefits, but have you seen anything at an entheogenic level? I personally have experienced what I'd say have been entheogenic experiences where I've come back feeling better, lighter, more whole, I guess you could say. But what's your experience?
Well, certainly. I mean, all the psychedelics, anecdotally and clinically, people will report a lift in mood for several days or weeks following the experience. And of course, magic mushrooms or psilocybin and LSD, they get all the press in terms of therapeutic, because those have been certainly the most well studied. Also ibogaine for addiction as well. But DMT doesn't really get much of a look in. I think part of that is because it's historical in that in the 1950s and 60s, when work was being done to treat alcohol addiction, for example, they were using LSD. And LSD and psilocybin in some ways are easier to work with, in that it is a longer experience. You can lay someone down on a bed and put eye shades on them and let them kind of ride the experience, the gradual build up and the peak and then the come down. It seems to be naturally suited to kind of therapeutic work, whereas DMT, it's like and then you come back. It doesn't seem to be, at first glance at least, ostensibly a good tool for therapeutics. However, I think that's probably something of a misrepresentation of the potential of DMT. And Rick Strassman, I've spoken to Rick about this, and he agrees, and he feels that the benefit that DMT has, particularly with this new infusion technology that myself and him developed, is that you don't have to just inject somebody and kind of fire them out of the cannon. It is possible to move them into the experience, push them deeper. If they're having trouble or they want to kind of come back and integrate, you can pull them out. You've got a lot of control because it's so short acting. You've got so much more control than you do with psilocybin and LSD. I think LSD and psilocybin are awesome and probably extremely useful in many, many types of conditions. However, there might be times when you don't want to just have someone in this space for several hours, but you want to let them dip their toes into the water and then bring them out again, talk to them, and then push them back, and then push them maybe a little bit deeper. And so there is a huge potential for controlling the level of the experience over several hours that you don't have with LSD. So I think DMT will find its place within the psychedelic pharmacopoeia of therapeutic psychedelic agents. But the other drugs have had much more of a head start. But I think in the future we are going to see DMT having a much greater role in therapeutics. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because we're now hearing terms like pharmawasca being rolled around at at equity levels, at venture capital levels in the US Wall Street. Now there's a number of people I'm aware of that have been looking at it for quite some time. For therapeutic interventions. So I think this is just the beginning, and it's good to bring you on, Andrew, to be able to have a chat, because oftentimes when we talk about psychedelics, we talk about it very much in the therapeutic context. I think we've opened something here that'll encourage a few people to expand beyond just understanding it, because there's an enormous value there therapeutically in psychedelics and also in DMT. I've experienced firsthand. But as you say, I think where we're really kind of untapped now is, I'd even say the fourth wave, which is the technology, not just looking at it as a way to radically change the landscape of psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy, but also radically change innovation, development, technology, and just the general concept of who we are, where we are, and what else is out there.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And there are, as I said, there are many people now. I think the clinical side of these things, the therapeutic side, is being well taken care of. We're in very good hands there. And, I know a number of these researchers, and there's no doubt that they are going to drive this revolution in psychiatry. But there has to be a space for people like myself, people who actually say, well, actually, these experiences do seem to gate access to some extremely bizarre and extremely powerful intelligences. What are we going to do with that? Are we going to dismiss it and just assume this is just pure hallucination? And that's what scientists have done for decades, is to say it is just a form of hallucination. But actually, my approach has always been, first of all, does that even make sense? It's an assumption to say it's just a hallucination. But when you actually look at the neuroscience of hallucination, the neuroscience of how our world model is constructed, it's actually difficult to explain how the brain is suddenly able to start constructing this bizarre alien reality, and why it would do so in the presence of the most common by far the most common plant hallucinogen, the most common naturally occurring psychedelic drug, is this extremely simple molecule that's found everywhere. And suddenly, when it enters the brain starts constructing bizarre alien realities filled with alien intelligence. That is not easy to explain. As people will tell you that it's easy to explain, or it's just your brain tripping, man. But as a neuroscientist, I can assure you it's very difficult to explain how the brain actually knows. I always describe it like a young American child who only speaks English suddenly starting to speak fluent Siberian Yupik, a completely alien language to them. And that's really what the brain is doing. The brain is starting to speak an alien language, in that it's starting to construct a completely alien reality that bears no relationship whatsoever to this reality. And it does it effortlessly. Within 30 seconds of you inhaling this drug, your brain is building this world with absolutely crystalline clarity, hyperdimensional reality, filled with intelligent beings that seems to represent this higher structure of reality, of which our normal reality is just a part. Where did that come from? This isn't just kind of a maelstrom of confusion that you kind of tumble into, where your brain is just trying to make sense of chaotic activity, which is what many scientists would say. This seems to be a freestanding, highly regular, astonishingly complex, hyperdimensional alien world filled with intelligent beings. That is not, despite what many people will tell you, even scientists, that is not easy to explain. And that is why I've devoted my life to trying to understand what this molecule is. What's it doing here? And what are we doing here?
And mate, I have a feeling this is not going to be the last conversation that you and I have. I'd love to catch up more. Unfortunately, we're out of
Sure.
time. But mate, if people want to find out more about you, where's the best place for them to find out more about you and your research and everything in between?
Yeah, so first port of call would be my website, alieninsect.net or buildingalienworlds.com, both the same site. There you'll find a links to all of my lectures and my podcasts and a lot of my writings as well. Also, follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Alien Insect is my handle. And of course, if you really want to learn, then my book, Alien Information Theory, Psychedelic Drug Technologies and the Cosmic Game, is out in hardback and in softback, full color book that describes my vision of reality and our place within it and the place of DMT within it. So that's kind of the culmination of my 25 years of thinking and writing and researching DMT is in that book. So if you really want to go deep, then buy the book. Also, importantly, I'm about to release in the next few weeks for free my psychedelic neuroscience master course, which will be available on my YouTube channel for free.
Wow.
For the foreseeable future. So if anyone's interested in really learning what's going on in the brain when someone takes psychedelics, all the way from the level of how it binds to receptors, through to how it affects brain cells, through to how it affects global brain activity and the structure of your reality. If you want to learn all of that, then in the next few weeks, again, if you go to my website, there's a course page where you can sign up for updates on that. And that will be on my YouTube page, our YouTube channel, Alien Insect as well.
You're a bloody legend.
So people, so that's my gift to the world because of this virus thing. I've got a lot of time on my hands at home, so I'm not out speaking and giving lectures, traveling to America or whatever. So that's my gift back to the world, is to create this course. So for the last few weeks, I've been working on this course and kind of learning to do my YouTube thing to a camera. So hopefully that will work out okay.
That's bloody awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, please
and we'll
sign up for that.
Send some traffic over your way. But as I said, Dr. Andrew Gallimore, this will not be the first nor the last time that we speak. I look forward to speaking to you again shortly, brother. Thank you so much for your time and your openness.
It's been great to speak to you. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.